Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Isabel Maria de Aguila from Lochac, who is teaching a class on gowns of the Golden Age, 1561 to 1585. Over to you.
Hola, welcome to this class on the gowns of the Golden Age. This is my favorite era of clothing within the SCA. And as a result is something that I have put a bit of time into looking at pictures online over the years. This class is looking at a document that I wrote back in 2007, where I attempted to define what the quintessential gown was of the age. So without further ado, allow me to share my screen and we'll get started. Right, so here we go, gowns of the Golden Age. Oh, something's not working, hold on a moment. Yes, so this is mostly an analysis of the portraits that were available online and in books in New Zealand back in 2007. I'll touch on at the end some of the difficulties that caused and also how things have moved on since then. But this was mostly for me to get a better understanding of what I was looking at when I was looking through portraits, because there were a couple of pieces of art that didn't sit right with me at the time that were identified as Spanish, and I wanted to understand why they were setting off my radar. And my Laurel encouraged me to be perfectly honest. So let's move on. Looking at characterizing the style itself as we see in portraiture. So the gown, and this is just a quick sketch up of a frock that I was planning to make a couple of years ago. I'm using that as an illustration to prove my point at this. So we've got smooth lines. You can see there's not a whole heap of gathering. There's not a lot of pleating. It's just a very sleek style of garment. And it's got quite a severe silhouette. It's quite strong. And we've got a lot of quite somber colors involved. We see a lot of blacks, a lot of reds. We don't see the bright pinks so much that you see in other countries. We've got the inverted cone-shaped skirt from the era, only we don't see it worn open in many gowns of this era. In fact, I haven't seen any open within this specific time frame. We've got a high-necked doublet that is front opening, and we've got some sleeves on that doublet that are open in some way to show an under doublet sleeve. And of course, we've got that dramatic trim placement that is just so flattering on virtually everybody, and discreetly used ostentatious jewels in the forms of ouches and aglets. But knowing that, what are the actual variations within the style? So what are we looking at in terms of the different sleeves, or the doublet slashing? Or why are some gowns worn with the neck unfastened, quite often quite a way down the front? Is there a variation in the different trim types or the placement of those trims? Is it always in those locations, or can it be in additional places or only in some of those locations? What about the aglets? Are they always on the skirt and the sleeve? What about the ouches? Do we see those anywhere other than on the doublet? What sort of fabrics were used and what colors do we see? And also just the under doublets, which are a huge area just in and of themselves. So what I did at the time was I went and I collected every possible image I could find that was identified as Spanish, that was identified from this time period. And I managed to find 35 of them, which these days is just a drop in the bucket, but at the time was huge. So these are the ones that I've managed to find since then on Wikimedia Commons. And I've got to say, the change in resolution of these images since 2007, just phenomenal. Right, so let's look at the colors. Within that set of 35 gowns that I had to look at, there was a significant narrowing of the colours from what I had expected, really. As you can see, the vast majority of the gowns are black. Oh, sorry, that's... So 51% were black. We had 29%, so nearly a third were white, and the rest were split between red, green, and brown. But it's highly likely that what we're seeing in portraiture now is not necessarily representative of the original shade in the portrait, or indeed the gown that was being depicted. So the green ones worry me because I've not seen any other references to green gowns of this style. And the brown ones, again, they might have been black, I don't know. So that's something that I needed to keep in mind when I was trying to define this quintessential Spanish dress. So I've tended to stick to either black or white or red when I'm making one of these dresses. The other thing we needed to look at was, what are they made out of? And from the pictures, it was possible to identify a number of fabrics, and that corresponded quite closely with the information we can see in Lochac. There we go. But because of the quality of the images I had access to at the time, it wasn't possible to tell exactly what was happening in nearly half of the cases. So we definitely had gorgeous, lustrous satins in over a third of all the frocks that I could identify, and brocades or jacquards or damasks, something that had a pattern that was a very similar colour, and there were definitely velvets, which led me to develop a theory on when you tend to see velvet gowns. I'm wondering whether or not you don't see velvet when you've got a long manga de punta, or the great sleeves, the great big triangular ones. Because if that's the case, I can imagine that velvet would actually act like Velcro, and that could make it quite difficult to move in that style of dress. It was bad enough with my mangas redonda, or the round sleeves. So I'm wondering whether or not the fabric can be, to an extent, dictated by the style of dress that's being made. I'm still only pondering this theory because I'm looking for more evidence one way or the other. Now, one interesting note for the satin gowns is that 75% of them are either cut or pinked. So they have these bias cut diagonals, cuts put in them to add extra interest to the fabric. And when I was looking for a better quality image last night, I finally found this really nice image of Isabel Valois wearing that beautiful red dress with all of the slashes in it, and the biberos and the mangas redonda. And when I zoomed in to try and get a nice picture of these cuts, I discovered that there was a pattern in the fabric. I'd never noticed that before. So I think I'm going to need to have a look at this project at some point later and reevaluate my ideas. So we've looked at the colours, we've looked at the fabrics. That now leaves us with the adornment. And even just a cursory glance at those images earlier would show that there were a number of different decorative elements used. So across the bottom, we have got just some clips of some of those. In a number of cases, more than one element was used in a gown, which can make it a little bit tricky to try and identify which elements are more common, and also identify where the preferred locations are for each of those elements. So that came down to number crunching. So what I've called trim is something that may have been embroidered and then placed on the gown, or it may have been embroidered straight onto the gown. I don't know at this point. For some of them, such as that red gown of Isabel Valois, It's quite clear that the skirt has been embroidered onto because there's a lot of puckering in the skirt, but there's none in the bodice. So that says to me that perhaps the bodice was embroidered in a different manner, perhaps stretched out with the frame, whereas the skirt perhaps wasn't treated the same way. But we don't see that with the other gowns of Anne of Austria, for example. So I've just called it trim to indicate that it is a narrower band, usually no more than 1.5 inches or what, 4 or 5 centimeters. And as you can see, they are on 72% of all portraits. The only thing that's more common is the ouches, and they're on 77% of all garments that I could find. Unfortunately, there were some images that just weren't good enough quality for me to be able to identify what was happening. But now that we're seeing better pictures online, I'm really hoping that this will help me resolve these numbers a little bit more, given what's available these days. So looking at what is seen where, I find it interesting that there is absolutely nothing in the terms of ribbon ties ever found on the doublet. Excellent, that strikes me as good taste. We see them on the sleeve and we see them on the skirt. We see the trim on the doublets. We see them on the sleeves and we see them on the skirts. So that strikes me as probably the quintessential decoration that we see on a Spanish gown. We augment it with ouches on the bodice, and we add ribbon ties to the skirt and also to the sleeves. Now you can see that there are other styles of adornment in the terms of beading and embroidery, and also those really fantastic beaded knots on that one spectacular portrait of Isabel Valois. But those all seem to be outliers, only in 1 or 2 gowns. So we've got our colour, we've got our fabric, and we've got our probable adornments. Before
we jump further, we have a question regarding what an ouch actually is.
Oh, okay. An ouch, or some people call them ouches, they are small jewels, basically. If you look at the picture second from the right, for a long time I mistook them for buttons just being put somewhere. They tend to be a metal that has got some kind of fine jewel in them. They are applied decoratively, or they may be used in belts. You sometimes see the same motif echoed from the cinturas and the gargantas, also in the dresses themselves.
Also a question, is it red or is it pink? It's coming up salmon on both dress and the aglet.
Oh, the dress, that's probably actually good question.
Yeah, the one from earlier.
The aglets do tend to come up, a lot of them with salmon or white tends to be the most common. That dress, it depends on the version of the portrait you're looking at. Personally, I've always interpreted as red, and there's been the occasional portrait that's had a little bit more of a sort of salmon touch to it. But again, I'm limited to my computer monitors and what I can see. I'm stuck in New Zealand and these portraits tend to be not here. Yeah. Shall I carry on?
Yep, that's it.
Excellent. So defining the elements. So this is where I attempted to establish how common the different variations were within each element. So if we look at the doublet, we know that the doublets themselves are close fitting to the body, not restrictive, but they sit smoothly over top of the supportive layers. They are high-necked and they have a collar that is high-necked. And the sleeves for adult women tend to be in one of 2 styles. And I'll get onto that in a moment. The centre front descends to a point, but as time goes on, the shape of that point actually significantly changes. We see it going from a point to a nib shape. And of course, these doublets are in some occasions shown partially open. So looking at the decoration placement, I have a crude drawing here showing the different placements for trim. And what I've done here is I have compared the placement of embroidered trim to the placement of ouches, so that I could try and identify what was common and where. So the blue is the trim and the yellow is the ouches. And if you compare that to the image, the center front is the pale pink line. The diagonal is that sort of mustardy yellowy line. The middle diagonal is the blue one. The shoulder is that hot pink, and the collar is that little green one just on the collar. The trim on the collar does tend to be in bands that go up and down rather than around. So that's why I've put that particular line in that direction. So you can see just by looking at this, that the most common placement for the trim is down center front, either side of the opening, followed closely by the diagonal. And in most cases, you see both trim and ouches. And then you definitely see, it's quite common to see trim on the collar as well. Now the shoulder, I'm trying to figure out whether that's because the angle of the portrait doesn't always show the shoulders particularly well. And I know that a number of the portraits I was looking at, again, it was that poor quality has limited my ability to see what I'm looking at. The middle diagonal is definitely rare. It's seen on one or two portraits of Anne of Austria. So I'm wondering whether it was a fashion that popped in briefly during her reign. Perhaps she let it and disappeared afterwards again. So we're narrowing down now on what we expect to see on the doublet of the quintessential gown. So if we look at the sleeves, I've put 3 sleeves here. The one in white is a manga redonda with a horizontal slip. The one with the yellow under doublet is again a manga redonda, but with a vertical slit. And the black one with the pearls at the lower edge, that is of course the manga de punta, or the great sleeve. In this case, I have looked at the portraits I've got and compared it to the 1589 version of Alsager. I have since acquired the 1580 version of Alsager, and that has one version of the great sleeve in it, the manga de punta. So that does change things slightly. But you can see that the vast majority of these gowns tend to have the manga redonda, and that makes sense. They use far less fabric, they are far more comfortable to wear. They don't drop in everything that's going past, and speaking from personal experience, your kitten can't climb them. This is hugely important. So if we look at the hanging sleeves, on the other hand, you'll note I haven't included them at all. I am of the opinion that the hanging sleeves are not women's wear. The only dress you see, or the only time you see people wearing them, they tend to be children and adolescents. And once they move into that adult age group, they're just gone. You don't see them anymore. It's like those wee shoulder rolls that sometimes pop up on the wee children. You never see them on an adult either. So I took them out of possibilities, because that was actually one of the things I really wanted to make when I started in the style, but I'm clearly going to have to make a dress for a child at some point if I want to make them. Unfortunately, there were a number of portraits where you just couldn't tell what the sleeve was. Even if it opens at the shoulder, you can't tell whether that's going to be a a vertically slit round sleeve, or if it's going to be a great sleeve. So we've got a little bit of uncertainty on some of those portraits. Right, so we've got our placement for our trim, and now we've got our sleeve types. which leaves the skirt. Now, I love the way these dresses flare just smoothly from the waist with no pleating. In fact, in not one image from period of an actual Spanish gown, not a Spanish influenced Italian gown, in not one picture do I see any pleats around the waist. Now, that's not to say there aren't some at centre back, and a lot of interpretations rely on that to give a bit of fullness. And frankly, when you look at the cutting diagrams from Alsager, they give quite a wide back piece, which indicates there could well be some pleating in there. Despite 50%, I think, of, let me just check that. So Alsager shows both the front and the back pieces of the skirts being cut on the fold, but these dresses do appear to be front opening. Not that we ever see them open, but the use of those ribbon ties with the aglets on them and the fact that we don't see anything on the side seam on those few dresses where we can see a side seam indicate to me that these do tend to be front opening. But again, that's just a guess that's based on personal testing of this theory. And the other thing is every dress in Alsager shows a train, and virtually every portrait we see where you can actually see the hem of the skirt and it's not obscured behind a chair or a table or something, shows a train. So most of these gowns do tend to be a saia intera, or the trained gown. So I'm thinking that's something I'm going to need to consider when I make my frocks of this style. Now, 14% of the gowns that we can see also show a fold in the skirt above the hem. Now, I have tried to recreate this once, and I got a fold that appeared to curve down quite strongly, which didn't really echo what we saw in the portraits. So I'm not sure how these work. I suspect they are a way to add a little bit of stiffness to the skirt. I suspect that they are also a way to allow you to adjust the length of the skirt or to refresh the hem when it starts to get a little bit worn without having to replace the whole dress. But again, these are just theories based on my one semi-successful attempt. So then if we look at the decorative placements or the trim placements, on 20% of the skirts, we didn't see any embroidered style of trim whatsoever. Nada. On 11%, you can see just one layer of trim. So one row down either side of the centre front opening. But by far the most common is having 2 layers of trim on either side of the opening. And it's significantly larger again. So from that point of view, I think we've got a quintessential style here. Looking at the hems, again, we're limited by the number of portraits that actually show the hem, and that was over half of them. So there's a lot of extrapolation required here. And we know that extrapolation allows errors. So it's just a matter of using the information we've got and making the best possible choice at this point. So from there, we've also got under doublets, and these are a whole rabbit hole in themselves. The variation within these is just stunning. So they are a close fitted garment. They are in Alsager, down as a jubon. They are all high necked, they are all collared. I tend to make them as bent sleeves if I'm just using plain fabric, but if I'm applying trim, I do tend to make them as straight because it's a little bit easier to get the trim to make sense on a straight sleeve. Again, we have a waistline that is descending at the center front, and we have a number of them fastened by buttons just at the wrist. And they all have small tabs at the wrist. But the trim on them is just fabulous. You see straight lines. Unfortunately, I don't have any images of them in here. I'm not sure where that slide went. And then we've got, so we've got straight lines that have got pinking or cuts in between the layers of trim. There's also ones that look like they might even be folded, whether it's box pleated or just knife pleated, I don't know. Then there are all the fantastical ones with the zigzag trims on them. For example, that red dress that we were looking at earlier for Isabel Valois. Then there's some of Anna Austria's ones which come to a V with very, very narrow braid coming to a line of trim that's down the center front of the sleeve. Then there is Isabel Valois' amazing pink one that's got the huge cuts and the beading and the embroidery, and they are just stunning items of clothing. And in many ways, they are the star of the gown. The outer gowns tend to be a little bit more somber, apart from that one red one by Isabel Valois, or worn by Isabel Valois, with all of the bebederos and the cuts on the sleeves. These have so many meters of trim in them. They have so much labor put into the making of them that it's mad that this tiny amount shows at the lower forearm, but at the same point, that small amount is absolutely the highlight of the dress. Oh, excuse me, how embarrassing. Now, where was I? Doublets, yes. So we have these amazing under doublets that are just stunning, and they are so fitted around the wrist. It took me a long time to finally spy out in a portrait that there were actually buttons there. When I found that, I was absolutely thrilled. No more desperately trying to wiggle my hand through a doublet sleeve that was a little bit too small. And the buttons are small and they are round and they are just delightful. Which then brings us on to, so what supports the gown itself? Oh yes, I've been missing out the terms associated with the garments. I apologise for that. They will be in the bottom right-hand corner as we went. So supporting the gown, how do we actually create the silhouette for this gown to rest on, and how do we keep it there? Well, it's the ubiquitous farthingale, the garment that is described in Alsager that is used under so many late 16th century and mid 16th century frocks of this sort of social status, social strata. I believe that underneath is a petticoat bodice, or a vasquina y cuerpo bajo. So you've got a supportive bodice that has a skirt attached, and there are a number of those in Alsager. Most of them do not have sleeves as part of the pattern, which is what makes me think that they are an undergarment. And indeed, there are a number of images of women wearing sleeveless, what looks like supportive bodices in the middle classes, or when they are the upper classes in distress. So that seems more likely than, for example, a separate corset, at least until later in the period. Underneath, we know that they must be wearing petticoats of various types. The terms associated here are vasquina, basquina, and manteo. So there is that fabulous wrap skirt that Matthew Nagy and Amanda Laporta have done amazing reconstructions of. And it's an amazingly convenient underlayer to wear with this style of dress. We also need something between the farthingale and the dress itself. I believe we need something between the farthingale and the dress itself, because I like there to be a layer that helps the overdress slip into place. I find when you've got hoops, particularly if they have been, they are held in place with velvet ribbon, you can get a little bit of a Velcro effect that stops things from sliding back into the place where everything is supposed to sit. So having another petticoat there just makes sure that everything sits quietly, and also helps disguise any ridges that you might have if things aren't sitting perfectly that day. Smocks, as you would expect, are worn next to the skin. For a long time, I assumed that they were high-necked smocks, and I'm not entirely convinced that they're not, because I can't imagine you would want to have these amazing jeweled and embroidered doublets sitting next to your skin. I imagine you would want to have something protecting your expensive clothing from your body oils. However, there are a number of images showing distressed women of this sort of status with a low square-necked smock underneath their petticoat bodies. So personally, I will continue to wear the high neck smock, and then putting my ruffs as detachable items that are not attached to the chemise itself. Right, and of course underneath, drawers. I know they're a controversial topic. We know that Juana Lochac had a number of drawers in her inventory, including a pair of fur-lined ones, which were clearly designed for warmth rather than functioning as underwear. But there are also linen ones that are known from the era, and frankly, they are really useful when you don't have enough petticoats or it is a particularly breezy sight. So that takes us to the end of the slides that I have to look at.
We do have one quick question.
Yes.
On the under doublet, the cuffs, what sort of buttons would they be? Would they be self buttons or something else?
Oh, these are the cool questions. I don't know. It really depends on the quality of the image that you've got. One that I've got makes me think that they are a small round button that is wrapped with gold thread. I can't remember which image that is, I'm sorry. And there is another one that I was looking at thinking, is that just a tiny gold button? So I think that's going to be a matter of more research, and with the better quality images coming out, this is going to be more and more achievable.
Cool. As a passing observation, I know Eleanor of Toledo, in the listings of what she owned, were a pair of red taffeta drawers.
Ooh, how scandalous.
And somebody has asked, Portia from Lochac has asked, how do you cope with the heat with all these layers?
Well, it didn't used to be a problem when I was a lot younger and stupider. But these days, linen. As much linen as I can get away with. Also, if I know I'm going to be at a location where the heat exceeds my capabilities, I will omit the under doublet and make a pair of tie-on sleeves, for example. There are also plans afoot for next Canterbury Fair where I'm going to make myself an apron that I can put slicker pads in to keep me cool under the skirt, which is not a historical response, but when you want to dress in a way that the climate doesn't let you, you've got to come up with different solutions. You can also set up quite a spectacular breeze just by swinging your farthingale frontwards and backwards by using your hips, and that will cool down your lower half quite nicely. So looking back at this, I have clearly been speaking a lot faster than my practice. So I'm going to take a moment to flip back to an earlier slide and discuss one of the unusual dresses. So if we pop back to...
Just while you're popping back, there's a question. Were the doublets and the underdresses separate garments, or were they a single dress?
Ooh, now, I used to be of the opinion that the doublet and the skirt were absolutely 100% a dress. And I still lean in that direction, that they are sewn together at the waist seam, even when there are tabs at the waist. But I can't guarantee that, especially looking at, for example, these two red dresses. Showing with Isabel Valois in her red satin. That really does look to me like there might be a skirt that is separate from the doublet in there. I don't know why I've got that feeling. I think it might be the fact that there is absolutely no tension on that upper doublet, the fact that the front opening is in fact gaping, whereas if there was a weight of a skirt on that, you would expect it to be pulled smooth. But all the other gowns, there is nothing that indicates to me that they would be entirely separate. So if we look at that oddity of a red dress, of which there are many, many different portraits done by different artists, these just happen to be the only two that I could find on Wikimedia Commons. There are also some by, let me check the name. There's one, a full-length one by Pierre Novellier, and several other individuals, which give you very different interpretations of the trim. Some of them make it look like it is entirely metal thread that's been sewn beautifully onto the satin. In other cases, it looks like there's a combination of embroidery and beading, which is just mind-blowing in those particular depictions. But looking at these two, we have quite an unusual dress. Not only are the manga redonda vertically split, which is a trend which seems to disappear quite early, about 1570 from memory. You've also got this amazing just shredding of the sleeve into these wonderful horizontal bands that we don't see in any other Spanish frock. On top of that, the doublet itself is open at the bottom, which is completely unusual. But then again, if you're wearing a piece of jewelry of that size, you're not going to open up the top of the doublet and risk that disappearing into it. But we also see an unusual feature here, the large slashes that go from shoulder almost to waist on either side of the front opening, called bebederos. And they are just, they're amazing. This was the dress that proved to me it was an under doublet and not just an under sleeve, like you see on the Dorothea gown in Janet Arnold's book. When these pictures are blown up to full size, you can actually see the continuation of that zigzag pattern through the doublet of the under doublet itself, through the bebederos, which made me wonder briefly whether or not there were petticoats that were also decorated in the same way and the whole thing was an underdress. But I'm not convinced by that theory anymore.
There's a couple of questions have come up. How is that red doublet fastened, do you think?
When I made it, I used strategically placed hooks and eyes. As to how it was done in period, if you look closely, just above the belt, you'll see there is one ouch that is actually covering the closure there. So I'm wondering if they're involved in some way, potentially. but I just used discrete hooks and eyes that didn't show on the outside.
Sure. Okay. And also, do you need chopines?
Every woman needs chopines. Yes and no. I have a pair. I adore them. I love wandering around with them, but they take a bit of getting used to. They do devastate the muscles up either side of the front of your shin. And if you want the proper silhouette, you do need another skirt that goes all the way down to the ground while you're wearing them. But personally, I tend to just use them to keep my skirts out of the muck.
Cool. And what stops the small bias cut slashes from unraveling?
The quality of the fabric. The fabric, a lot of the fabric that we get these days is comparatively loosely woven. If you've ever been through the fabric gallery at, I think it's the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, they have just stunning extant fabrics, and you can tell that they're just so much more closely woven than what we have. So when we slash something open, the fibers tend to have enough room to work their way out a little bit, whereas the period ones, they were a lot more closely woven, so they don't tend to fray as much. But that said, I do actually have a red satin gown that is bias cut all over it. And even after wearing it to a ball, the amount of wear and fraying was just enough to really highlight the cuts, so the difference in the texture between the cut surface and the shiny satin. And it could actually afford to rough up quite a lot more to really enhance the effect of the cuts put onto the satin. So fraying is part of their appeal. If you look at the costumes that have been worn at the Globe Theatre, for example, there were a number of items back in 2003 that had been worn for however many shows. It was quite a substantial number, and they were starting to look worn, but the fraying just really accented the fabric more and more and more as it got more raggedy. It was amazing. Yep.
That's it from the current question list.
Awesome. So the other weirdnesses with this particular dress is, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the skirt and you look at the edge of the embroidery, you can see that there is a range of puckering there. So that tells me that these skirts, well, this particular skirt on this particular dress was embroidered without the fabric itself being under any tension like you would expect from a frame. And if we compare that to even the sleeve, if you look at the left-hand side of the portrait, so her right arm, there is some embroidery or beading down in that bottom corner, but we don't see the same level of puckering at the edge of the design. And on the doublet itself, on the body, again, nowhere near that same amount of puckering. So I'm thinking that the sleeves and the doublets, being smaller pieces of fabric, are secured for embroidery, whereas the skirt, being a large unwieldy chunk of fabric, is probably embroidered a little bit more freehand. Now, embroidery is not my specialty, but that's my current working theory for it. Right, so I'm going to be terrible and flip right to the end of this again. Sorry, I should have thought about this last night. So what has changed since I actually did this piece of research? Well, it was 2007 for a start when I finished it. We have just an enormous number of additional portraits available. For example, this one has actually become one of my favorites. Never saw it when I was doing this particular piece of research. It's gorgeous, and the quality of the images has just improved enormously. just looking at this particular picture that I thought I had a good quality image of, when I was tootling around the internet a couple of years ago, I found out that there are pleats in the back of the sleeve here, which was something that I'd been doing just to add a little bit more body there to help it the huge extra fabric in the manga redonda just to sit out a little bit more. And what do you know? It was happening in the period portraiture. I just couldn't see it because the quality of the images that I was getting down here in New Zealand in 2003 through to 2007 were comparatively poor quality. So it's amazing what this is doing for our understanding of the fashions because of the advance of technology. So I'm all for this. It's great. There are just more resources. There are books being published all the time. There are wills becoming available, and people like Amanda Laporta are very kindly making her translations of the wills available for us to look at, which is just blowing my mind with the information that's available for what Spanish women had in their wardrobes when they died. And then we've got some fantastic books out. Admittedly, my Spanish isn't really good enough to understand them yet, but there's a wonderful one on the Virgin de Lupo, I think, that shows all sorts of information on the different layers of clothing from a religious point of view. It's fantastic. And we're seeing more and more reenactors entering the Iberian space and sharing their work. And even the few pictures that I found last night that I hadn't seen before got me so excited that I'm really looking forward to seeing where my understanding goes when I have a look at redoing this piece of research, because frankly, looking at it now, it needs updating and I'm looking forward to it. So if you want to see what I do, there is my website, Permana Isabel Maria. My household has a Pinterest page and an Instagram page and a YouTube account as well. And you're welcome to follow our persona development as we go on those particular locations.
Okay, it's 10 minutes to go and we have 2 more questions.
Wonderful,
the
yes.
questions is, whoops, hang on, sorry, I've lost my mouse, which is a terrible burden. Okay.
Oh, considering the various layers required?
Yes,
Is there
please.
a sequence of construction? Absolutely. Start from the skin out. Always, always start from the skin out. Smock, petticoat bodies, under doublet, gown. Oh, sorry, I missed out the farthingale there. So that would be smock, petticoat bodies, farthingale, under doublet, gown, then roper or anything else.
Cool. Okay, 2 more questions. How do the ties work? And while you're answering that, can you pop the contact information back up, please?
Yes. Oh, let's have a look. Can I do that? Absolutely. So let's have a look. How do the ties work? Personally, because I think from memory that I've seen the same ties and aglets on 2 different frocks from one queen, I actually think they're just sneakily pinned in place. With the stunning quality of the images that we're seeing these days, I'm not seeing any eyelets that indicate that we might be threading it through. And looking at the sheer heft of some of those aglets, we're talking a diameter of at least 1 centimetre. The eyelets would absolutely be visible at that point. I have tried sewing them into both sides of the skirt and both sides of the sleeve and then tying them up, but you get an unsightly gap. So the last set that I made them up as their little half bows with the aglets on them, and then I just pinned them in using straight pins.
Cool. And one last question. Sometimes you see large bracelets halfway up the forearms. How are they made and worn?
I have absolutely no clue. I went out and bought myself some large bracelets that looked like that and made sure they were large enough to go over my doublet, and then I just snapped them on. I also have a set that's elasticated. And that does quite well for sitting nicely without cutting off my circulation.
Okay, that's it from the questions, and it's 7 minutes to 10.
Brilliant.
So nicely timed and spaced.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming to this class. I hope you have, if not learned something, then at least enjoyed yourself. And I look forward to seeing many, many more Spanish Saya Entera out there in the reenactment space.
Thank you very much. I will stop recording.